I've been told for a long time that I need to be consuming some form of omega-3, if that's fish or if that's a supplement, and it's been especially drilled into some people's minds, especially vegans and vegetarians. One of the major champions of filling in omega-3 deficiencies for vegan and vegetarian eating individuals is Dr. Joel Fuhrman, a physician, accomplished author, scientist, and a big proponent of the plant-based lifestyle. However, along with that plant-based lifestyle should be supplementation, or the general consumption of omega-3 fats, a type of polyunsaturated fat that comes primarily in DHA and EPA forms. Okay, seems pretty benign, right? Well, I had the fortune of running across a video by Mr. Jeff Nelson from VegSource, who put together a poignant presentation on why people who consume a plant-based diet, especially vegan and vegetarians, are being duped into consuming omega-3s when there's no quality science. Beyond that, he claims much of the fault falls on Dr. Joel Fuhrman, as he sells omega-3 supplements for vegetarians and vegan consuming individuals. But beyond that, he also has a questionable past related to an influential study that released indicating that plant-based consumers are deficient in omega-3s. So here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to walk you through some of the claims and crack open some of these studies to get to the bottom of it all. To be clear, I will be skipping certain sections because I don't actually care about Dr. Fuhrman's questionable involvement in a particular study, though we will likely touch on it. I'm more interested in actually answering two primary questions related to the overall stance. So one, do primarily plant-based consumers like vegans and vegetarians suffer from omega-3 deficiency? And two, before that, is there any merit to consuming omega-3s anyway? Who cares if we're deficient if it actually doesn't do anything in the first place? This is already going to be a longer video, so use the chapters to skip around or skip to the end for the main points. And because I'm not going to be focusing too much on the details of Dr. Fuhrman's involvement in this particular study, I will of course link the original video in the description for those that are interested in more detail. So let's discuss.
6 years ago in 2019, I made a video that stirred up a lot of debate about how Dr. Joel Fuhrman, who sells DHA supplements, designed, funded, and conducted a study that supposedly showed vegans are deficient in omega-3 fats. But here's the twist. When you actually look at the data, Dr. Fuhrman's study showed the opposite. It showed that vegans had higher average omega-3 blood levels compared to the group of non-vegans that were selected to serve as the control group in a comparable study.
Mr. Nelson is talking about this study where people who were consuming a vegan diet for at least 1 year without omega-3 supplementation were compared against a group of omnivore consuming individuals who also did not supplement with omega-3s, whose data was collected for other work. Now, the researchers then compared the blood omega-3 levels, called an omega-3 index, which is the amount of omega-3 polyunsaturated fat found inside the red blood cell membranes. Unlike what Mr. Nelson claims, the vegan group did not have greater omega-3 levels. Both groups were the same. So the vegan and the omnivore group seen here, notice the percent omega-3 at the bottom for the present study. Then across several other studies doing similar comparisons. One thing I'll note here is that they only included 40 of the vegan participants in this table, not the full 160 plus participants. And that's because they had to match certain characteristics like, think like matching sex and age. This is a possible point of bias and weakens the data, but it doesn't actually make it inherently bad data. Even when looking at the full vegan group, including everyone, the omega-3 index was still very similar, only ticking up 0.2%. So, to be clear, in this study's comparison, the omega-3 index was the same for vegan and omnivore. And for all the other selected studies, the vegan group had generally lower omega-3 index compared to the omnivore group. That means that it is inaccurate to say that Dr. Fuhrman's study, the one that we just went over, showed the opposite of his claims.
So how did a finding that contradicted the fear narrative that shows that vegans did not have lower omega-3 than non-vegans, how did that get spun into a marketing campaign for vegans to take DHA supplements?
Real quick, let me point out that this study in total does not contradict that people who are low in omega-3s, if they're deficient, is a different story that we'll get into, because Mr. Nelson brings up a great point later. But for now, I disagree that there isn't data that vegans have a lower omega-3, as we just saw, ironically, from other cited studies instead of the main study, but I digress.
That's what this video was about back in 2019, and it's even more relevant today because if you zoom out to 2025, we're living in a time when confusion and misinformation around food and health has gone into overdrive. And everywhere we turn, the messages are contradictory and they're profit-driven. We've watched protein myths resurface and dominate headlines. We've seen an over-reliance on drugs like the GLP-1s, the medications that treat symptoms while ignoring the causes of disease. And we've seen a cultural backlash against anything vegan or plant-based, whole food, often coming from the industries that stand to lose if people simply ate unprocessed food and stayed well. So it's a world where science has been traded for clicks. Supplement companies, even vegan ones, now behave like mini drug companies, manufacturing, deficiencies so that they can sell you the fix. And that's really the point of what I'm showing here. Whenever a company or an individual stands to make money selling something, and they do their own study to prove that you need it, that's a red flag. We all recognize bias when the tobacco industry funds research showing that cigarettes are safe, or when the egg industry pays for studies that prove eggs are heart healthy. But the same kind of bias can happen inside the vegan and plant-based world too, of course. If someone stands to profit from a certain result, there's a powerful motivation, even if subconscious, to design, interpret, and present their findings in a way that benefits their business.
Yeah, I don't disagree on the overall point, largely true. I might quibble about some of the details, but overall, I agree that there are instances where companies will manufacture a problem and sell the fix.
And that's not science, that's marketing dressed up in a lab coat. The whole healthy fat craze was one of the first examples of that dynamic in the vegan community. It crept in during the early 2000s, long after pioneers like Esselstyn, McDougall, Ornish, Pritikin, Kempner, and others had already reversed heart disease on low-fat, starch-based diets.
I've covered some of those studies in the past, like Dr. Esselstyn's work. There's a lot more to say on that front, because considering that we're talking about study quality and results, I have to quick mention that Dr. Esselstyn's work has some major flaws. I'll link my videos dissecting that in the description. Still, no doubt, groundbreaking work.
Now, back then, nobody worried about getting enough fat. In fact, they knew well that too much fat was toxic, regardless of whether it came from animals or plants.
A lot to unpack here, too. I'd probably ask what context, because some very high-fat diets have shown some excellent results. I'll link some of that work in the description. And the composition of the diet certainly matters. Again, not to the point, not really the main point of this video, but I didn't want to say absolutely nothing here.
But then the story changed because one man selling his healthy fats made it change. And he funded a study. He rewrote the definitions of deficiency and then marketed fear to a vegan audience that trusted him. And here's where it gets worse. Before the study was published, the same researcher quietly removed his own name and involvement from the paper. Why? Because if he'd been listed as an author, the journal would have had to disclose a financial conflict of interest. The study was designed and funded and conducted by someone who sells the very supplement being tested. In other words, if the public saw that disclosure, they might have said, wait, this is like the egg industry telling us eggs are heart healthy. So instead, the connection was hidden and the study went out looking like an independent piece of independent science when it wasn't.
Mr. Nelson is talking about Dr. Fuhrman here again, and like I said, he goes far more into depth on the topic that I won't focus on here, but he brings up some solid points. So again, the video is linked, but it's still inaccurate to say that his name was entirely removed, as he was credited in the study, though not as an author, which is still could be misleading and potentially unethical. However, it is also inaccurate to say that the study was completely independent, as one of the authors is a famous omega-3 researcher, Dr. William Harris, and he's acknowledged for having potential conflicts of interest. I'm not sure how much having an additional conflict of interest disclosure would matter, but maybe it would, I don't know.
So I'm re-releasing this 2019 investigation because it documents exactly how that happened, how the vegan world was taught to be afraid of omega-3 deficiency, how DHA supplements became must-have accessory, and how the commercial science, even from within our own community, how it can quietly reshape beliefs that were once grounded in solid evidence. So let's go back to 2019 and watch again. The talk is called How Vegans Were Duped into Worrying About DHA and Healthy Fats. Okay, the topic for today's video was originally DHA. My last video debunked the need for DHA supplementation. Dr. Fuhrman wrote a rebuttal to my video on his website, and I was planning to analyze that rebuttal and explain where I thought he was incorrect. But that video is going to have to wait, because while studying the question, I discovered that one of the main studies used to promote the idea that vegans are deficient in DHA appears to have involved scientific misconduct.
Okay, I'm going to skip forward here. This early part describes some of what we went over and several additional details. I'm much more interested in the two questions that I presented to you at the beginning, the actual science.
I'm about to expose how I believe DHA supplements, and even the more recent focus on healthy fats, how this became a topic in recent years in the vegan community. Omega-3, DHA, healthy fats, these were never issues that were of concern to anybody or that they cared about when I went vegetarian 30 years ago or when I went vegan about 25 years ago. And this is not just because we were in the dinosaur age of the vegan diet, but it was because it wasn't important then, and it isn't important now. Now, the one area where fish oil and DHA was once thought to be of possible benefit was in regards to heart health. But DHA supplements have been shown to be of no benefit to heart health. The American Heart Association says that anyone taking DHA supplements is doing so in the absence of scientific data that shows any benefit of the supplements. No other medical specialty other than cardiology has ever recommended DHA, including neurology, immunology, and psychiatry.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. Several medical organizations find omega-3 supplementation, of which DHA is a major one, do not help against cardiovascular disease-related events like stroke, heart attack, death, and so on. Okay, a few things to say on that front. First, medical guidelines change over time and they tend to lag behind the science simply because general guidelines need to be extremely careful and consider multiple areas of study before changing a stance. For example, in the 1980s, folic acid was not explicitly recommended for pregnant women, and then a few studies released showing that it reduced the risk of spina bifida. And it wasn't until almost 10 years later, sometimes longer, that different health organizations explicitly recommended folic acid for pregnant women. To be fair, the relationship is not one-to-one, as the effect size of folic acid was dramatic in its protective nature. But we are talking about A, shift in the narrative, and B, a serious lag in the explicit recommendations, and C, a special population. The second point to be made here is that there are some major medical organizations that do recommend omega-3s even in supplement form, like the American Heart Association, who have clearly updated their stance since the 2012 statement. In this most recent advisory statement, they acknowledge some of the shortcomings of omega-3 supplementation, but they also point out some of the strengths. Ultimately, they conclude this after surveying 53 studies. The recommendation for patients with prevalent CHD, so that's coronary heart disease, such as recent MI, so that's myocardial infarction or heart attack, remains essentially unchanged. Treatment with omega-3 PUFA, so that's polyunsaturated fat supplements, is reasonable for these patients. Even a potentially modest reduction in a CHD mortality in this clinical population would justify treatment with a relatively safe therapy. So they argue there is some benefit of supplementation. Other organizations like the European Atherosclerosis Society also recently released a target statement pointing out that omega-3s are recommended for people with high triglycerides. That specific recommendation is tight, though. It's specific to pharmacological grade omega-3 and EPA-specific omega-3, one of the other major forms of omega-3 fats. The point being, while some organizations still say not to bother with supplements of omega-3s, others, especially some specialized in cardiology, seem to be more permissive. Beyond that, even the Mayo Clinic, which we saw from the video, was anti-omega-3 supplement and still is, as of this recording on heart health, acknowledges that fish oil, a dominant form of omega-3, is recommended, but from fish, not from pills. They even have a small blurb on their website acknowledging that there's some research indicating that supplements do improve triglyceride levels and may help against rheumatoid arthritis. And that arthritis angle is echoed by several arthritis organizations. As a final point, I have reviewed many of the studies on omega-3, and while not universal, there are multiple randomized controlled trials that indicate benefit of long-term consumption. I've looked up to now at cardiovascular health and brain health. I'll link my analyses in the description. Now, there's much more to say on all this, but the point here being three things. One, medical organizations tend to lag behind the science simply because enough scientific data needs to be collected to make safe recommendations. So it's unsurprising that several don't recommend omega-3s as supplements, but that doesn't mean that they don't recommend omega-3s as a whole. Number two, there are several reputable organizations that have started to look a bit more favorably on supplementation, and even when not supplementation, the general idea of omega-3s, which for vegan individuals would be supplementation, is encouraged. So three, there are several human trials indicating benefits of omega-3 supplementation on cardiovascular health and brain function. So yes, there is evidence for omega-3s, DHA or not, being a health benefit, answering one of our questions. But none of that indicates if deficiency specifically is a problem. So let's get into that.
It's important to know that omega-3 blood testing is not standardized. It's not like getting a cholesterol test or a test for thyroid function where labs agree on how to test. With omega-3 tests from separate labs, you can get very different results with the same blood sample. Not only that, but different companies have unique definitions for what constitutes optimal level, and some have their own special proprietary test that they claim is better than everyone else's. The point is omega-3 testing is not standardized and experts have not established normal ranges. Doctors rarely test for omega-3 because few doctors see a need to test for it. It's experimental and it's not thought to be particularly relevant to anything. Low DHA levels have never been shown to cause any disease or health problem. DHA supplements are being studied primarily by people who make money from selling them or who profit from selling omega-3 blood tests. In determining who had sufficient omega-3 in their blood and who was deficient, Dr. Fuhrman's team decided that you have to have over 4% omega-3 in your blood or else you are deficient. Now, Quest Diagnostics, on the other hand, which is one of the biggest diagnostic testing outfits in the US, this is their page on omega-3. They say that being above 3.2% means you have an optimal level. That means that Dr. Fuhrman's team chose a considerably higher level for their study in order for someone to have optimal or desirable omega-3. Omega Quant, another omega-3 testing lab, their owner was one of the authors of the Fuhrman DHA study. They define optimal as having 8% blood omega-3 and above. So it's all over the place. If Dr. Fuhrman's team had opted to choose the level that Quest Diagnostics and several other labs and hospitals, Cedars-Sinai, I know, if they had used their level of 3.2%, then most of the vegans in Dr. Fuhrman's study would have had optimal levels of omega-3 instead of most of them being deficient. The average blood level of patients in Dr. Fuhrman's study was 3.7% according to the study. So the vast majority of those patients would be fine. There would be no need to have them take any DHA supplement. So by opting to use a higher definition in Dr. Fuhrman's study, 2/3 of the vegans, as well as 2/3 of non-vegans, were deemed to be deficient. So you can see when Dr. Fuhrman or Dr. Greger referred to this study as evidence that vegans are deficient, it's just because Dr. Fuhrman's team decided to pick a definition that made most people deficient.
Okay, so the short of it is people are classified as deficient based on the threshold set for deficiency. Now, one test uses a much lower value of what is commonly touted by omega-3 researchers is anything below 8% omega-3 index. I think this is a great point. It's true that makes all the difference, as a low threshold would mean that far fewer people are deficient. The next question that we should ask ourselves is, was this 8% cutoff an arbitrary money-grabbing scheme, or was it backed by some evidence? Well, before I answer that, I realize that this is already a super long analysis, and I'm about to go into some more details on omega-3 deficiency for you, but if you're looking for an even greater depth, me cracking open some of these studies and dissecting the data and explaining what that data means for you and your health, different doses of omega-3s and how they affect your omega-3 index and more, be sure to check out the extended analysis along with the accompanying article, and I'll even discuss it more in my monthly podcast. All of that is available exclusively for the Physionic Insiders, plus discussion in my regular live sessions with me and the insider community. If you're interested in joining and getting full access to all my work, check it out with the link in the description and join the Physionic Insiders. I'd love to have you aboard. Okay, back at it. I decided to attack this question from two angles. One, going back to some of the earliest studies that spawned this 8% threshold, like this one. So in this study, they looked at supplementation of omega-3s and what doses raised the omega-3 index. However, what we're most interested in is why the 8% was decided on, which is explained neatly in one simple graphic here. The more red and the lower the numbers, the worse. The more green, the higher the numbers, the better. Why better though? Well, the researchers are using different studies that measured omega-3 content in participants' red blood cells and then related that to generally cardiovascular risk, like sudden death. In the groups of individuals that had a low index as defined here, like the lowest omega-3 index group in the Seattle study, they had an omega-3 index of 3.3%. And when compared against another group in that same study with an omega-3 index of 6.5%, the greater omega-3 index was related to better cardiovascular health. So this would indicate that there is definitely a point at which being lower on the scale does associate with greater risk of at least some health issues. So to be clear, this is an association, but this is consistently seen across multiple studies. Still, it's also possible this initial study that we're focused on cherry-picked, meaning that they only included certain studies to create this relationship, especially as one of the authors of this study is the same Dr. William Harris as our very first study, the same one with an omega-3 business. This is where I turn to my second way to probe this question for deficiency. Are there unaffiliated studies that corroborate these effects? Admittedly, many studies include Dr. Harris, and for good reason. I mean, he's a well-known expert in omega-3s, but there are several studies that are A, not affiliated with him, and B, not affiliated funding or otherwise with any omega-3 company, like this one or this one. And there are several others. And it seems across the board that people with a lower omega-3 index are worse off than those with a normal or high omega-3 index. So if we return to this question, are vegans and vegetarians deficient in omega-3s? Well, we saw a few different numbers for vegan and other plant-based diets omega-3 index, but all of them would put them squarely in the deficient category based on what we went over. Even in this initial study indicating 3.5 or even 3.7% omega-3 index. Now that we have the context that 8% omega-3 index isn't arbitrary and has at least some mounting evidence to support it, it would seem that vegans and vegetarians and even omnivorous style eating can still land someone in a deficient state. I don't mean that like a vitamin C deficiency where your gums start bleeding and you'll die a pretty abrupt manner, but as a subclinical or marginal deficiency where there's increased risk of disease or death associated with low levels, which is what we just went over. So here's how I would wrap all this up. One, based on the current scientific evidence, omega-3s as a whole benefit our health, especially cardiovascular health. Two, supplementation has some evidence pointing to it being a benefit for most, likely less so for those who consume fatty fish regularly. Three, those with an omega-3 index of less than 4% are likely to be subclinically deficient and likely would benefit from a higher omega-3 index, especially including those that focus majority, if not completely, on plant-based diet. But this really applies to anyone who doesn't eat fatty fish twice per week. Now, I didn't go over a ton of studies on omega-3 and our health to save what little time I could, but I have done that right here. So I'll meet you right over there, and I'll post everything in the description since there's multiple links. Thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.